It starts with a farm, a quiet piece of land passed down through generations owned by a 93-year-old black woman who's seen storms come and go, but nothing like what's about to hit. When a ruthless developer sends a gang to scare her off her own land, he thinks it'll be easy. But what he doesn't know is, her son is a Navy SEAL, and he's coming home not just to protect her but to expose something far bigger than any of them imagined. What follows is a war of silence, corruption, and community resistance that will test everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and family. Trust me, this story doesn't end where you think it will. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The morning began the same way it always did for Ethel Maynard, long before the sun had the courage to rise, long before the valley's shadows dared to stretch across the fields. She moved quietly, not because she had to, but because the silence belonged to her. The land, the light, the air, just before dawn, all of it breathed in rhythm with her bones. The floorboards creaked beneath her slippers as she passed the weathered hallway. Her fingers brushing the edge of an old family photo hung slightly crooked on the wall glass cracked from a storm back in '82 that nearly took the roof. She paused at the screen door, her eyes catching the faintest glimmer of gray on the horizon, and for a long moment she simply stood there, one hand resting against the frame, the other curled loosely around a chipped porcelain mug filled with weak coffee and years of memory. Outside, the mist rolled low across the earth, like a tired ghost, refusing to leave, weaving between rows of dormant cornstalks and the edges of old oak trees that had seen more winters than most folks in town. Ethel stepped onto the porch, her knees stiff her back, hunched not from weakness but from decades of planting, harvesting, fighting off droughts and debts, and county men who showed up with clipboards and smiles that never reached their eyes. She didn't fear the cold that lingered in the mountain air, or the dampness that crept into her bones each morning. What she feared, what she had begun to feel in the quiet moments, was the shift, the tilt in the way the wind carried certain sounds now, like truck engines on roads too close, or voices where none should be. There was a pressure building, not in her joints, but in the very air around her, like the land itself was holding its breath. Ethel moved slowly across the porch and down the 3 uneven steps to the dirt path leading toward the barn, each step deliberate as though the land needed reminding she still belonged to it. Her hand trailed along the top of the fence as she walked, fingers grazing the smooth grain of wood her husband once cut by hand. She stopped near the garden beds where the last of the collard greens had grown tough and stubborn, much like her. A rusted wind chime whispered in the distance, and she turned slightly, listening not to the chime itself, but to the silence that followed it. She didn't say anything at first, just narrowed her eyes and looked down the hill past the tree line toward the old service road that ran along the edge of her property. "That road's been too busy lately," she muttered, not to anyone, but not exactly to herself either. Her voice had the rasp of someone who didn't waste it on things that didn't matter. By the time she reached the barn, the chickens had already begun to stir. The roosters called into the fog like sentries, and the scent of hay and cold earth welcomed her in. She fed them slowly, counting under her breath as she always did, watching the way the birds moved. Jumpy, unsettled feathers bristled more than usual. The mule in the back stall snorted twice and refused her hand, backing into the shadows with a twitch of his ears. Ethel's jaw clenched. Something was coming. Back at the house, she set her mug on the windowsill and unfolded a yellowed envelope from the drawer beneath the sink, the one labeled "in case" in faded marker. She hadn't opened it in years, but the time for waiting felt over. Inside was a phone number, a name she hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral, and the only photograph she had left of him in uniform, smiling like the world hadn't yet broken his heart. She traced his face with one finger, then reached for the old rotary phone, the kind that clacked with each turn. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the choice. When the line picked up, there was no greeting, just a breath on the other end. "It's Mama," she said. "I think it's time." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." She hung up without another word, the click of the receiver echoing through the kitchen like a promise kept. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sit down in the worn rocking chair by the window, hands folded, eyes on the road that led through the trees. Outside, the mist had begun to lift just slightly, revealing the cracked gravel path that curved up from the main road. The wind had shifted, and in it Ethel smelled diesel and smoke, faint but real. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply leaned back, rocking slowly, and whispered to no one at all, "Let him come." The land had taught her patience. But it had also taught her that some roots, once grown deep enough, couldn't be pulled out without tearing the earth apart. It started with the sound of tires, slow, deliberate crunching along the gravel road like something too confident to hide, too certain to rush. Ethel Maynard didn't have to look up to know the kind of man behind that wheel. She had known the sound of intrusion all her life, long before it had names or business cards or polished shoes that never touched dirt. She stayed seated on the porch, rocking gently the mug of now cold coffee steady in her hand-eyes, watching the line where her road met the tree line, where fog was beginning to burn away under the rise of late-morning sun. The truck emerged slowly from the mist, big black too clean for these hills, its chrome grille gleaming like a sneer, moving without haste, but with purpose, like it already believed it owned everything it could see. The man who stepped out had the kind of body that spoke more about gyms than fields, more about mirrors than labor, but what struck Ethel wasn't the shape of him, it was the way he moved, as if the land under his feet owed him an apology just for being uneven. He wore a brown leather jacket, crisp jeans boots with no scuff marks, and a smile that never touched his eyes. Behind him, two others stepped out, slower, broader, less clean, their tattoos crawling up their necks like roots from something buried deep and rotten. Ethel didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as the man approached hat in hand, but not in humility, and when he reached the bottom step of her porch, he lifted his chin and gave her the kind of smile folks in this county reserved for talking, down to women they thought were too old to fight back. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, voice smooth like syrup, but sharp underneath like a blade hidden in cloth. "Heard you were still out here all on your own. Hell of a place for a woman your age." Ethel took a long breath, let it settle behind her eyes, then replied, "Not slow, not sweet, just clear. Been my place since before your daddy knew how to tie his boots." That made the man chuckle, but it didn't soften him. His eyes darted across the porch, the door, the old scarecrow down in the field, now missing a hat, its shoulders slumped from wind and time. He looked back at her, adjusting the collar of his jacket like he was about to settle into a role he'd played too many times before. "Name's Bragg. Russell Bragg. You probably heard it around town," he said, resting one foot on the bottom step like he was about to be invited up. "My company's got interest in this area, expanding infrastructure, revitalizing old land, bringing jobs and opportunity back to the valley." Ethel didn't blink. "You mean tearing up these hills for rock and coal and laying waste to what you don't understand?" Bragg smirked, but his eyes narrowed. "That's a mighty dramatic way to put it, Miss Maynard. I prefer to think of it as progress. This valley's been stuck in the past too long. Folks are ready for change. And you got a lot of land here for one woman, especially one who hasn't filed for crop subsidies in over a decade." The air shifted then. Not the wind, not the temperature, but something quieter like a door swinging shut in the back of Ethel's memory. She stood slowly, knees cracking, spine creaking, but her eyes never left his. "You been poking through my papers?" Bragg raised both hands lightly, mock innocent. "Public records, ma'am. I'm a businessman, not a criminal. Just trying to make sure no good opportunity goes to waste." Ethel took a step forward down the first stair until they were level eye to eye. Her voice was lower now, but firm. "Let me make something plain, Mr. Bragg. This land ain't for sale. Not to you, not to anybody. And if opportunity means gutting what 3 generations bled to hold on to, then maybe the valley don't need it." Bragg's smile disappeared, then just flickered out like a porch light losing power. One of the men behind him shifted his weight, cracking knuckles, but Bragg raised a hand to still him. He leaned in just enough to lower his voice, not for privacy, but for effect. "You're a proud woman, Miss Ethel. I respect that. I really do. But pride don't stop bulldozers, and it sure as hell don't stop the future. This valley's changing whether you sign on or not. You got time to think about it, but not much. I'd hate for someone to get caught in the middle of progress." Ethel didn't flinch. "Is that a threat?" Bragg held her gaze a second longer, then shook his head. "Just a friendly reminder." He turned then casually, like nothing had passed between them, like he hadn't just left something heavy and oily in the air. His boots crunched over gravel as he returned to the truck. The other two followed slower, throwing one last glance over their shoulders, as if memorizing the space like men who planned to return. Ethel watched the truck disappear back into the tree line, the sound of tires fading into a silence thicker than before. She stood there a while longer alone now, with the mist rising again around her ankles like a ghost remembering its way home. She didn't move until she felt the first stir of wind against her skin, carrying with it the scent of something bitter, something old, something she had smelled once before, right before the accident that killed her husband, when a different man had come smiling with contracts and promises and eyes just as cold. She walked back inside, slow, and measured each footfall firm against the floor she had swept clean every Sunday for 40 years. At the hallway closet, she reached behind the coats and boxes, and pulled out the old box where she kept things no one else needed to see. Inside was a letter from her lawyer, a copy of her deed, and a scrap of paper, with a number she'd told herself she'd never use. She stared at it for a long time. Then quietly she reached for the phone. The sun was setting low behind the Tennessee hills when the first hum of a diesel engine touched the edge of the valley distant. At first just a low vibration tucked beneath the breeze, but enough to make the crows scatter from the treetops and the air grow still. Ethel stood by the porch railing, hands wrapped around the worn wood, her eyes fixed on the path that curved along the ridge where pine shadows fell long and crooked. She didn't move, didn't speak, just waited, the air thick around her with that old kind of silence, one that knew too much, held too much, and asked nothing in return but attention. The truck appeared a minute later, coated in the dust of 4 states, its sides dull roof dented from a life of urgency and nowhere to rest. The man who stepped out moved like someone who'd spent years carrying weight that no one could see, broad-shouldered, measured in every step, posture straight, but weary, his boots sinking slightly into the red clay like even the ground. He remembered him. He didn't rush to the porch. He didn't wave. He just looked up at her, eyes darker than she remembered, framed by lines time and war had drawn without permission. "Hey, Mama," he said, softly, the words catching for a second like a stone in the throat. Ethel didn't answer right away. She studied him, taking in the scruff around his jaw, the tension in his neck, the duffel he carried in his left hand. Only after he reached the bottom step did she exhale low and deep. "I didn't think it'd take just one call," she said. Her voice wasn't cold, just tired in the way that only mothers get when they know exactly how much it costs to ask for help. Marcus gave a faint smile, the kind that flickered and disappeared before it ever reached his eyes. "You've never called before, and I hope I never have to again," she said, turning toward the door. "Come on in." The screen door creaked like always, and the floor still groaned in that third spot near the hallway where the boards had never settled right. But neither of them spoke as they crossed into the kitchen, the air filled with the scent of old wood-brewed coffee, and something unspoken that lingered like smoke long after the fire had died. Marcus set the bag down near the wall, his eyes sweeping the room like a soldier scanning for escape routes even in his own childhood home. The pictures were still on the mantel, the dented stove still clicked twice before catching, and the clock above the sink still ran 3 minutes slow like it had for decades. But time had not paused in this house. It had simply folded itself around pain and memory, quiet and sharp, like a paper cut. "I saw the tire tracks on the road," he said, finally, voice low. 3 different sets, one fresh. Ethel nodded, pouring coffee into the same chipped mug he used to drink from as a boy. "They come by just to remind me who they think's in charge. And you didn't call the sheriff." She slid the mug toward him and sat across the table. "Sheriff's niece married Bragg's cousin last year. You think he's gonna help an old black woman defend a farm? He's been waiting 40 years to see bulldozed." Marcus looked down, fingers tracing the rim of the cup. His jaw flexed slightly, the kind of silent anger that didn't boil but burned long and low. "You should have told me sooner. I should have done a lot of things," she said. "But you made it clear after your father's funeral that you weren't coming back. And I wasn't about to beg." He winced slightly at the memory, at the words that had been thrown like stones in that hallway so many years ago. But he didn't defend himself. Not this time. Instead, he looked up. "Why now?" Ethel's eyes held his steady and sure. "Because something's changed. They used to come with offers. Now they come with threats. One of them burned the scarecrow last week. Said next time it won't be straw." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his body shifted forward slightly, like a man leaning into the wind before a storm. "You think they'll actually come back?" "I don't think they ever left," she said. They sat in silence a moment longer, the only sound the soft clink of ceramic as Marcus lifted the mug and took a slow sip. The coffee was bitter, overbrewed, but he didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I'll stay in the guest room," he said. "You'll take my room," she replied. "It's warmer, and your knees ain't what they used to be." He smirked just a little. "You haven't seen my knees in 20 years. I've seen your father's, same bones, same pride. both too damn stubborn to bend unless forced. He didn't argue with that. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out across the fields that had raised him and haunted his dreams, especially in those far-off deserts where the soil was foreign and the gunfire was constant. He saw the fence line, the crooked post near the orchard, the patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived tractors, storms, and men. He remembered planting those seeds one spring when he was 9, thinking they'd never bloom. But they did. They always had. Behind him, Ethel's voice came softer now. "I didn't call you back for vengeance, Marcus. I called you back so I wouldn't have to face this alone." He nodded, not turning around. "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in years he meant it. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because this land, broken as it was, still held something worth standing for. The sun slipped below the ridge in the distance, leaving a red-gold glow across the fields, casting long shadows over the porch, the road, and the roof he used to fall asleep beneath when life was still small enough to fit into a boy's back pocket. Inside the house, Ethel rose slowly and began setting out 2 plates for supper. She didn't ask if he was hungry. She just did it the way she always had. And from the window, Marcus watched the last of the light fade from the sky and felt for the first time in years like he'd stepped back into something he couldn't quite explain, something deeper than memory, heavier than grief. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight at least he knew where he stood. The following morning broke cold and clear, with the mist burned off the hills and the sky stretched open like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Marcus stood barefoot in the dirt beside the barn, arms crossed over his chest, scanning the horizon with the kind of stillness that came from years of having to measure silence. His breath fogged in front of him, the kind of breath that carried weight, not from cold, but from what he already knew in his bones. This land wasn't just threatened, it was already being mapped, measured, targeted by men who didn't need to own something outright to control it. Moose arrived not long after sunrise, stepping down from a muddy pickup truck that looked like it had wrestled with back roads all night, and nearly lost. He was taller than Marcus, broader in the shoulders, with a limp that never quite left his right knee, and a voice that carried humor even when there wasn't much to laugh about. "You didn't say it was this far out," Moose said, shouldering his bag and glancing around the quiet fields. "Thought I was lost half the way here." Marcus didn't smile. "You weren't. This place just makes people feel like they don't belong unless the land invites them." Moose raised an eyebrow. "And it invited them?" "It didn't," Marcus said, his voice flat. "They forced their way in." They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of wind in the trees, the only thing moving between them. Then Moose dropped his bag near the porch and followed Marcus back toward the barn, eyes sharp, already scanning, not as a visitor but as someone who understood what it meant when someone's home was no longer safe. Inside the barn smelled of soil, motor oil, and hay, a comforting combination, except for the corner near the workbench, where Marcus had laid out a map, half covered with notes, photographs, and satellite images printed from military-grade surveillance software. "Tell me what I'm looking at," Moose said, crouching beside the table, fingers tracing a set of back roads marked in red ink. "Private security firm out of Atlanta," Marcus replied. "But it's a shell, fronted by a developer named Russell Bragg. Claims he's revitalizing the area, but he's really doing contract clearing, not legal eviction. Not court orders, just pressure." Moose's jaw clenched. "You mean threats?" Marcus nodded. "And if that doesn't work, intimidation, sabotage, and disappearances. This isn't about one old woman's land. It's about a corridor, one that stretches through 3 counties and connects old timber trails to interstate rail lines." "And this property?" Moose asked. "It's the keystone," Marcus said. "Whoever controls this farm controls the safest access point into the entire stretch." Moose looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "And they don't care who has to be pushed off to make room." "No," Marcus said, "they don't." The 2 men worked the rest of the morning in near silence, setting motion sensors along the back fence, installing infrared cameras in the tree line, and walking the perimeter in a slow, steady rhythm that felt more like recon than routine. Every time Marcus passed the orchard, he noticed the way the grass had been pressed down, faint tire marks that hadn't been there the day before. Ethel didn't come outside, but she watched them from the window, her silhouette framed by fading curtains, one hand resting on the windowsill, as if bracing herself against the weight of what she had allowed to begin. By mid-afternoon, they returned to the house and sat in the kitchen, the light through the west-facing window falling in warm streaks across the table, highlighting the scuff marks in the floor and the quiet tension that now lived in the air like a third presence. They're watching, Marcus said, not asking but stating. Every time we move they'll adjust. And they're not alone. Local officials are tied in, maybe even law enforcement. Bragg doesn't just use pressure, he buys silence. Moose sipped his coffee, slowly staring at the wall. So this ain't just about land. It's about logistics, money, transport routes, blackmail, and power, Marcus added. Because out here, whoever decides what gets built also decides who gets to stay. Ethel spoke then, her voice quiet but steady from the doorway. They never saw me as a person, just a problem that refused to move. Marcus turned toward her, his expression softening just slightly. You're not a problem, Mama. I am to them, she said. And I've been one for a long time. She moved to the table, slow but sure, and sat down across from the two men, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The light caught the edge of her silver hair, and for a moment she looked like something carved out of stone, and time unmoving, unshaken, and entirely out of place in a world that rewarded surrender. I've seen bad men, she said, but I've never seen them move like this, quiet, coordinated, like they ain't afraid of anybody watching. Because they think no one is, Moose said. Well, she said, lifting her chin, they're wrong. Marcus looked at her, then out the window toward the fields, the barn, the far road that curved into trees thick with shadow. He thought about how many times he'd walked those woods, as a boy, slingshot in one hand, dreams in the other, never imagining they'd become the front line of a war no one wanted to admit was coming. Now every sound felt sharper, every breeze more like warning than comfort. The land was alive but uneasy. And somewhere beneath the surface, something darker was coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to strike. He stood slowly, nodded once toward Moose, and said, tomorrow we start watching them back. And in that moment, the house no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like the beginning of a fortress. The sun had barely dipped beneath the treetops when it started again, just like Marcus knew it would, just like Ethel feared it might. He had been standing near the porch, watching the sky shift from blue to burnt gold, when the sound of tires returned louder this time, less cautious, more like a declaration than a warning. The truck was the same black beast from before, but tonight it was accompanied by another, a rust-red pickup that rumbled like thunder across the gravel, its headlights off even as dusk swallowed the road whole. Moose stepped out from the barn before Marcus could call for him, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing, the second he saw the two vehicles slowing to a halt at the edge of the property. They're back, Marcus said, voice flat, eyes fixed on the shadowed figures stepping down from the trucks. Moose didn't respond with words, just let the rag fall to the dirt and rolled his shoulders once, a small shift, but meaningful the way a soldier loosens his stance before a confrontation, not because he wants it, but because he's accepted that it's coming. The men who approached this time weren't just muscle, they were confident, careless in the way only men who believe themselves untouchable can be. One of them lit a cigarette with a flick of his thumb, not caring how dry the leaves were along the road, or how fast flame might travel if given just a little wind. The lead man, tall, pale, heavy in the chest, with a gut that strained beneath his flannel, gave Marcus a crooked smile as he reached the fence. He didn't bother pretending this was a courtesy visit. He simply leaned against the gatepost, exhaled a ribbon of smoke, and said, "We gave you time. Now we're here to make sure you understand what's coming." Marcus didn't move. "You've made yourself clear enough." The man laughed short, mean. "Nah. Not yet. See, talking don't always get the point across. Sometimes a man's got to show what he means." Behind him, the second truck bed rattled as one of the younger men yanked something out, a bundle of twisted straw, dressed in old denim, hatless head hanging limp. Marcus recognized it before it hit the ground. It was the Scarecrow, the one that had stood for over 20 years in the southern plot, stitched together by Ethel's own hands, back when he was still a teenager, learning to plant rows straight. They threw it at his feet like garbage, and when it landed, the air shifted. Even the birds quieted. "You think burning down a straw man scares me?" Marcus asked, voice even but edged. The tall man stepped forward, his boots crunching dry gravel. "Nah. That was just the start. Next time, maybe it's the shed, or the tractor, or something a little closer to home." Moose stepped up, then placing himself slightly to Marcus's left, his expression unreadable, but his stance firm, calm, like a wall built brick by brick from years of discipline and too many battles in places the rest of the world didn't even know existed. "You light anything on this land," Moose said quietly. "You'd better be ready to explain it with a broken jaw." The tall man blinked momentarily, thrown off by the calmness, the certainty. Then he laughed again, louder this time, and gestured toward the trucks. "Y'all think you're heroes or something? This ain't a war zone, boys. This is just business. And you're standing in the way of people with plans bigger than you." "This land has plans too," Marcus said, not stepping back, not blinking. "And you're not in them." The man's face twisted then, not into a snarl, but something worse, something smug calculated, like he'd just been waiting to push past words. He dropped his cigarette, ground it out with his boot, and looked up at the porch where Ethel had just stepped into view, arms crossed over her chest, wrapped in her shawl like armor. "Lady," he called out, "this ain't gonna end the way you want. You ought to be smart, take the money, let the old place go while you still got breath to bargain." Ethel didn't flinch. "The only thing older than this land is my patience. And it's wearing thin." Her voice cut through the fading light, firm and full, the kind of voice that had once read scripture aloud in front of 35 children during a summer so hot the walls had sweated. Marcus watched the man hesitate just a beat, just enough to know that the words had landed somewhere he didn't expect. Then without warning, the man turned and kicked the scarecrow, sending it tumbling across the ground in a crumpled heap of hay and denim. The others laughed loud and cruel before piling back into the trucks. One spat into the grass as the engine roared to life, sending a cloud of red dust spiraling up toward the porch. The two trucks peeled out down the road, spinning gravel behind them, their taillights flickering like warning flares vanishing into the tree line. For a moment no one spoke. Then Ethel stepped off the porch, walking with slow, measured steps to where the scarecrow lay in the dirt. She bent down, carefully lifted its shoulder with both hands, and looked it over like a doctor checking a patient long past saving. Marcus moved beside her, reaching to help, but she waved him off with a look. "I stitched this together the year your father got his first tractor running," she said quietly. "Said it'd keep more than crows away." Marcus crouched beside her, brushing hay off the face of the dummy. "It still can, Mama." She looked at him, and for the first time that day something in her expression softened. Only if the men standing behind it remember why it was built. They carried the scarecrow back to the barn together, not because it would be useful again, but because you don't leave a symbol broken in the dirt, not on this land. Not when everything around you is trying to make you believe it doesn't matter. By the time they reached the door, the sky had turned violet, the fields cast in shadow. Marcus glanced back at the road, now empty again, and felt the weight settle deeper into his shoulders, not like fear, but like preparation. Something had changed. And from that moment on, it was no longer about holding ground. It was about drawing the line. By the time word spread through the hills, it had already grown, legs twisted, exaggerated, sharpened by fear and silence carried on front porch, whispers and gas station glances that ended too quickly when a familiar face walked in. In a place like this, where memory stretches longer than asphalt and grudges grow roots deeper than trees, it didn't take much for stories to turn into warnings. Folks had seen the trucks pass by Ethel Maynard's place more than once now. Headlights off at dusk, taillights flickering like eyes that didn't blink. Some said they saw men with chains stepping out near the southern fence. Others swore they heard something burning. Most didn't ask, and even fewer offered help, not because they didn't care, but because they'd been taught what happened to those who stood too close to trouble, not their own. Inside the Freeman General Store, the bell above the door rang softly as Marcus stepped in the air, changing the moment he crossed the threshold. Conversations stalled. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. A woman near the back reached instinctively for her child's hand, though there was no real danger in the room, just an old tension stirred awake by something new. Marcus didn't look at them directly. He nodded once toward the counter and made his way past the shelves, with quiet certainty boots thudding against the old wood floor, in a rhythm too deliberate to be mistaken for casual. Moose was already at the register, one hand resting on a sack of livestock feed, the other tapping lightly on the edge of the counter like he was counting seconds in his head. The young man behind the till, barely 20, pale nervous, tried not to meet his eyes. Marcus stopped beside Moose and spoke low. "We need fence wire, heavy gauge, and batteries, as many as you can spare." The clerk hesitated. I'll have to check in back." Marcus nodded once. "Do that." The boy disappeared without another word, and the store fell back into its slow, deliberate quiet, the kind that hummed low and steady like a storm cloud that hadn't quite decided which way to move. Moose didn't say anything at first, just leaned slightly toward Marcus and murmured, "They're watching us like we walked in here with rifles." Marcus scanned the room with his eyes, not his head. That's because they've already picked sides, and we're not on theirs. They waited in silence until the clerk returned, arms full of supplies, eyes darting toward the window like he expected someone else to arrive behind them. He bagged the items quickly without looking up. "Put it on my mother's tab," Marcus said. The boy nodded once. "Sure, y'all take care." Outside, the wind had picked up tugging at the corner of an old political sign, rusting near the ditch, one that promised growth and change from a name no one trusted anymore. Moose tossed the supplies into the back of the truck, then slammed the tailgate shut. "You feel that?" he asked. Marcus slid into the driver's seat. "Yeah, same air I breathed outside Kandahar. Tight. Like something's watching even when you can't see it." Back at the farm, Ethel was hanging sheets on the line like it was any other Wednesday, though her eyes tracked every bird, every gust of wind, every movement near the tree line. She didn't ask what they'd found. She just said, "Storm's comin'. You feel it in your jaw first, then your gut." Marcus stood by the post where the scarecrow used to be, his hands resting on his hips, face turned slightly toward the horizon. "Town's not with us." "They never were," Ethel replied. "But that don't mean they all against us either. Just means they scared." Moose walked up from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that smelled faintly of motor oil and stubbornness. "People don't stay neutral long when bullets start flying." Ethel looked at him, then at her son. "Well then, let's hope they pick the side that knows how to shoot straight." The three of them stood there in silence, the wind pulling at the last clean sheet, snapping it like a flag in the afternoon light. From the edge of the pasture, a single cow lowed, slow, uncertain, then turned its head as if listening to something in the distance. The moment passed without a sound, but the message was clear. Lines were being drawn. Not in ink, not in law, but in presence, in silence, in who kept showing up when it would have been easier to stay home. Later that evening, Marcus sat on the porch steps with his boots off socks, dusty jeans rolled at the ankles, watching as fireflies blinked between the trees, like flickers of memory trying to hold their shape in the dark. Behind him, the house creaked with age, with history, with the kind of memory that doesn't ask for permission before settling into a man's chest. Moose stepped out, handed him a mason jar, half full of something clear and strong, and sat down beside him without speaking for a while. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," Marcus finally said. "But I think it's been looking for me a long time." Moose took a slow sip and let it burn before answering. "Maybe it's not about trouble finding you. Maybe it's about you being the only one willing to stand in front of it." Marcus nodded slowly, eyes still on the trees. "Either way, it's here now." And in the quiet that followed, with only the hum of insects and the distant crack of a branch far too heavy for a squirrel, the night settled into place, thick, expectant, and completely unwilling to promise peace. It began just past midnight, when the wind shifted without warning, and the dogs stopped barking, not because they were asleep, but because something in the air made even instinct pause. Marcus had been sitting at the small table by the window, an old road map spread before him, and a pencil resting between two fingers that never stopped twitching. Moose was on the porch feet, up on the rail, shotgun across his lap, head tilted just enough to catch the sound of every rustle, every crackle, every breath of movement the dark had to offer. The night had been quiet for hours, too quiet in the way that feels staged like a stage before a scene turns violent. Then the headlights cut through the tree line like blades, first one, then another two, ATVs, then a flatbed truck behind them rolling slowly with its lights dimmed, tires barely crunching gravel as they turned onto the edge of the Freeman property. From a distance they might have looked like late-night farmhands, maybe teenagers, up to nothing more than mischief, but Marcus knew better the moment he saw how the vehicles spaced themselves, how the engines pulsed at idle without moving forward. It was the rhythm of control of men who had practiced this dance before, of operations dressed in the clothes of chaos, but carried out with precision. He stood slowly, not in panic but in readiness, and called out low, without turning. "Moose." "I see 'em," came the reply, followed by the soft metallic sound of a shell being chambered. The house didn't light up. No one turned on a lamp or flicked on a porch bulb. They didn't need to. Every path had been mapped, every shadow memorized, every contingency discussed with the calm repetition of men who'd learned that survival was not a matter of panic but of posture. From the rear of the truck, three men climbed down, their silhouettes broad and fast-moving, flashlights in hand, voices low and sharp. "They're coming through the orchard," Moose said, "trying to flank from the east." You want to let 'em?" Marcus didn't answer with words. He grabbed the radio from the table, pressed a button twice, two sharp bursts that activated the tripwires they'd set along the south fence. A second later, a loud snap cracked the air like a whip, followed by a shout of surprise, and the dull thud of someone hitting the dirt hard. "Tripwire got one," Moose said, stepping off the porch and vanishing into the dark like smoke curling through trees. Marcus moved fast but silent, skirting the edge of the cornrows, every footfall deliberate, every breath controlled. He could hear them now, boots, scrambling men, yelling at each other in hushed curses, one of them shouting, "Find the damn lights! Where the hell are the lights?" And then the most familiar sound of all fears setting in. He waited until they reached the halfway point of the field before activating the flood lamps. 4 halogen beams snapped on in unison, bathing the rows in white light so harsh and sudden it cut through the night like judgment. The intruders froze, blinking, momentarily stunned, their bodies outlined against the pale dirt like ghosts caught mid-flee. Marcus stepped into view, then shotgun cradled low but ready voice, calm but not kind. "That's far enough." The man in front, shorter than the others, stocky face, wrapped in a bandana, raised a pipe in one hand more out of habit than strategy. "We don't want no trouble," he said. "You brought it with you," Marcus replied. "Now you can leave with it or without it. Your choice." Another man rushed forward, younger, louder, adrenaline clouding good sense. He lunged at Marcus with a rusted tire iron, screaming something incoherent, and Marcus dropped him with a single shot of rock salt to the thigh. The man hit the ground screaming, clutching his leg as the others scattered like rats in daylight. That was when Moose reappeared, flanking from the side rifle raised but still not firing. "Next one that moves toward this house is leaving without knees," he said, his voice flat, almost bored like he'd said it before and meant it every time. The remaining men hesitated, unsure whether to help the one on the ground or run, and never look back. One of them started to speak, but Marcus cut him off with a shake of his head. "No speeches. Just go." They backed away slowly, dragging their injured friend toward the truck, muttering curses under their breath, eyes wide and teeth clenched. The ATVs spun, first spitting dirt. As they fled back down the road, the flatbed swerving behind them like a snake slithering toward cover. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by the tree line and the night they came from. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was taut and buzzing, the kind of quiet that comes not after danger but before the next wave. Marcus lowered his weapon and walked slowly back toward the house. Moose followed behind his footsteps, heavy with the kind of weariness that comes from knowing this was just a test. Not the war itself, but the tap on the shoulder that says, "We're watching, we're coming back." On the porch, Ethel had been standing the whole time, a pistol in her hand, steady as stone, eyes dry but sharp. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at her son and said, "How many?" "4," Marcus replied. "One down, rest ran." She nodded once, then added, "They'll be back. That kind don't like being humiliated." Marcus sighed the breath deep and slow, then leaned his shotgun against the porch rail and sat on the top step, elbows on his knees. Then next time he said, "We don't warn them." Moose lit a cigarette, handed another to Marcus, who took it without hesitation even though he hadn't smoked in years. The smoke curled into the night like a prayer spoken through teeth too tired for words. They sat there in silence for a long while, the kind of silence that didn't demand anything but endurance, each man wrapped in his own thoughts, his own version of the fight they'd just weathered. The moon was high now, casting long silver shadows over the barn, and the fields illuminating every broken stalk and scuffed bootprint like evidence in a story too old to retell. And when Marcus finally stood, stretching his back and rolling his shoulders, he didn't speak. He just looked out at the fence line, eyes narrowed, mind already calculating the next move, not out of fear, not even anger, but something deeper, something quieter. Resolve. That's what it was. And that night, under the watch of stars and the hush of wind, the Freeman farm didn't just defend itself, it declared something bold and undeniable. This land would not go quietly. By the time the sun had fully climbed over the hills the next morning, the dust from the night's assault still clung to the porch rail, to the boots by the door, to the silence that lingered between each cautious breath. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee cooling in front of him, untouched, his fingers tapping absently against the rim, not in impatience, but in rhythm, like he was keeping time with a storm he couldn't yet see, but already felt building deep inside his chest. Across from him, Moose leafed through the photos they'd collected, still frames from the security feed, grainy but clear enough to make out faces, vehicles, license plates, and most damning of all, uniforms that didn't belong to any official organization but moved with the kind of precision that didn't come from backwoods bravado. They weren't local muscle, Moose said, not looking up. The guy who flanked the eastern side, he was running drills, not instinct. Marcus didn't reply at first. He took a long breath, eyes still locked on the window where Ethel's silhouette moved slowly beneath the morning sun, her body small and deliberate as she fed the chickens like she had every morning since 1963. That routine hadn't changed, not for weather, not for grief, and certainly not for fear. But Marcus knew she'd felt it too, the shift in the air, the weight of something far more calculated than rural intimidation. "They're not just trying to scare us," Marcus finally said, his voice low like the truth carried heat. "They're cleaning up something." Moose nodded slowly. "Which means they've already been dirty." They spent the better part of the day combing through evidence, pulling backup data from the shed's hard drive, overlaying timestamps with satellite data, cross-referencing arrival points and departure windows with regional maps. What started as a defense plan quickly evolved into something closer to reconnaissance, a slow unmasking of a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight, built not with threats but with bureaucracy, not with fire but with forms. At noon, Ethel brought in a manila envelope she said had been left on the church steps last Sunday, unmarked, folded, nearly forgotten. Inside were property transfer logs from the county office, showing parcels of land sold under pressure names erased and replaced with LLCs that all led back to the same holding company. Marcus flipped to the last page, fingers pausing over a name scrawled in ink too heavy to be accidental. "Bragg Development and Resource Consolidation," he read aloud. "Sounds like someone threw every word into a blender and hit puree." Moose leaned over to look. "But that address, that's out of Baton Rouge." Marcus stood slowly, the chair creaking beneath him as he pushed away from the table. "Then this isn't just a local land grab, it's infrastructure. They're building a corridor." He walked to the wall and unrolled the larger topographic map he'd brought from his last deployment, the one that showed not just terrain but transport routes, rail, water, utility, and fiber. When he pinned their property in red, the entire picture changed. The farm wasn't just valuable, it was central. It sat at a convergence point for a stretch of land that had been quietly bought up for the last 6 years. Some of it was marked for redevelopment. The rest was marked for silence. "They're not trying to own the valley," Marcus said, pointing to the rail access line and the covert fiber trunk. "They're trying to control everything that moves through it." Moose stared for a long time, then folded his arms. "Which means if your mama hadn't held on, they'd have already finished." The weight of that truth hit harder than any bullet Marcus had ever dodged. He turned slowly to face the window again, where Ethel now sat on the porch, one hand resting on her cane, her eyes unfocused but still sharp, still listening. She had known. Maybe not the whole scope, but the pattern, the way people vanished from public records without moving, how deeds changed hands, without signatures, how promises came in polished shoes and left in gravel-streaked silence. Later that afternoon, Marcus drove into town not to buy supplies, but to ask questions, the kind that didn't get written down, the kind that made people glance over their shoulders before answering. At the feed store, he asked about Earl Henry's land. The clerk looked down and said Earl moved away, suddenly didn't leave a forwarding address. At the post office, Marcus asked about the new P.O. box numbers linked to the LLCs. The woman behind the glass told him she didn't know who picked them up, only that it wasn't someone from around here. By the time he stepped into the courthouse, the air felt heavy with avoidance. The county clerk smiled too wide, her hands moving too quickly over the keyboard. When he asked for copies of transaction records, she said the system was down. When he asked about Bragg's connection to the zoning committee, she said she didn't know that name, but her eyes told him she did. Back at the farm, the sky had turned to steel, and the light cut sideways through the trees like blades of glass. Marcus spread the documents across the barn table again, this time connecting pins and strings like a caseboard, each one marked with dates that pointed not just to corporate manipulation, but to something more deliberate, a process of forced erosion slow enough to be ignored, fast enough to be irreversible. "They're not stealing land," he said to Moose, who was sitting on an overturned bucket beside him. "They're eliminating resistance." Moose rubbed the back of his neck. "So what now?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the rafters, then out the side door where the field opened wide and the wind pressed low against the earth like something was coming fast and didn't care who saw. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just clear. "Now we stop being defenders." He reached for the camera gear, began packing it with military efficiency, his movements sure unshaken. "We start exposing them." Outside, the chickens clucked nervously in their coop as the wind picked up, and somewhere in the tree line a single branch cracked under weight, unseen. But Marcus didn't look back, because now he knew exactly what they were up against. And more importantly, he knew how to fight it. The rain came soft that evening, not in sheets but in a steady whisper that settled over the roof like an old memory returning home. Marcus sat at his father's old desk in the corner of the barn, a single overhead bulb humming faintly above him, casting long shadows over a stack of manila folders that smelled of dust, ink, and buried truths. Outside, the steady rhythm of droplets tapping against tin played like background music to the storm, stirring inside him, one not made of thunder or wind but of names, dates, signatures, and stories, long denied the dignity of sunlight. He had been digging through the old records all afternoon, files that Ethel had kept boxed and bound in the attic for decades, tucked behind yellowed quilts and broken picture frames no one had looked at since his father's funeral. She hadn't said much when she handed him the key earlier that morning, only placed it on the kitchen table beside his coffee, her hand resting on top of it for just a moment too long before walking away. Marcus had known by then that whatever he found would come with weight, and it did. The documents were more than he expected. Property line disputes. Letters of protest his father had written in blocky, forceful handwriting. Legal threats from companies that didn't exist anymore, at least not under the names they had used then. But it wasn't just the paper trail that struck him. It was the margins, the scribbles, the small notes his father had left for himself, like battle markings etched into a map no one else was meant to read. Notes like, "C. Landry, see page 4, and Bragg's father met me back down." Something changed after. Marcus leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the creaking of the wood beneath him settle into his ribs. He could still see his father's face, stern but kind a man, who wore silence like armor, who believed in justice, but never quite trusted the system to deliver it. He remembered the night before the crash, how his father had come home later than usual, mud on his boots, blood on his knuckles, and a look in his eyes that Marcus hadn't understood then, but did now, resolution, mixed with resignation, like someone who finally knew the game was rigged but refused to fold anyway. Behind him, the barn door opened with a slow groan, and Moose stepped in water dripping from his jacket, his boots leaving wet prints on the concrete floor. He didn't speak at first, just looked at Marcus, then at the open folders, then back at Marcus again. "You all right?" Moose asked, voice low, careful. Marcus nodded, but the movement was stiff. "Found the trigger," he said. "Found the fuse, the match, and the hand that struck it." He passed over a folded sheet of paper, one that had been tucked between pages in an old manila envelope marked with his mother's handwriting. Moose unfolded it slowly, brow furrowing as he read the first lines. It was a letter undated, unsigned, but unmistakably from Samuel Freeman. A letter to the county commissioner, outlining a meeting with a man named Conrad Landry, who had offered a deal that came with no paperwork, no witnesses, and a veiled threat attached to every sentence. It ended with a single line scrawled across the bottom in red pencil. "If anything happens, tell Marcus it wasn't an accident." Moose looked up, jaw tight. "You think they had him killed?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the edge of the barn where the rain dripped from the awning in steady lines, and placed one hand against the doorframe, as if bracing against the world outside. "I don't think," he said. "I know." The weight of those words sat heavy in the air, like the barn itself had gone still just to hear them spoken aloud. Marcus turned back slowly, his eyes sharp but wet at the corners, not with tears, but with the kind of pressure that builds when a truth has been buried too long and finally finds the light. "I spent my life thinking he lost control on a wet road," he continued, voice steady but shaking underneath. "But he didn't lose control. They took it from him." Moose nodded, slowly stepping beside him, folding the letter again with more care than usual. "So, what do you want to do?" Marcus looked out toward the fields, toward the tree line, toward the place where the road curved just out of sight, where his father's truck had left the gravel all those years ago and never returned. His jaw clenched as he answered, "I want them to feel what it's like to be exposed." He didn't say revenge. He didn't need to. What he wanted wasn't vengeance. It was clarity, truth in full daylight. an end to whispers. That night after Moose turned in, Marcus walked the perimeter of the property alone. The rain now light enough to make everything shine, but not heavy enough to drown out the sounds beneath it. The creak of the old swing by the walnut tree, the rustle of leaves over the back fence, and the occasional low groan of a frog sheltering beneath the porch. He moved quietly, almost reverently, as if retracing his father's steps from decades ago, seeing not just the land, but the history that pulsed beneath it. Near the southern edge, he stopped and looked out across the creek bed where a stand of cedar trees formed a natural barrier between his property and the land that had been sold off years earlier. He remembered fishing there as a boy, his father crouched beside him baiting hooks and telling stories he now realized were warnings. He stood there a long time, letting the sound of the rain fill him, letting the silence answer the questions he had never asked aloud. When he returned to the porch, Ethel was already there, sitting in her usual spot blanket over her knees, eyes fixed on something far beyond the darkness. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "You know now, don't you?" Marcus sat beside her, his clothes damp hands, cold, voice low. "I do." She nodded, once slow and quiet, as if a weight had finally shifted off her shoulders after decades of keeping it in place. "I should have told you," she said, "but you were just a boy. I didn't want it to harden you." "It didn't," he replied, eyes fixed ahead. "But it changed me." For a while they said nothing, just sat side by side, the night stretching long and silent around them, the land breathing beneath their feet, the rain easing into mist. And when Marcus finally spoke again, his voice was softer, not broken, but deeper somehow. "I'm not fighting to protect the land anymore." Ethel looked at him confused. "Then what are you fighting for?" He turned to her, the rain glinting in his eyes like embers. "I'm fighting for the truth." And in that moment, beneath a quiet sky and a sleeping town, the line between past and present blurred just enough to remind them both that some battles don't end with fire. They end with light. It was late afternoon when Sheriff Ray Duncan finally pulled his cruiser up the long dirt drive, tires crunching slow and steady over gravel that had never been kind to polished boots or city folk. Marcus was already on the porch, arms crossed, shirt damp from repairing a fence post, eyes fixed on the horizon with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but calculation. The sound of the engine didn't surprise him. It was the timing that did, too soon for a patrol, too late for a courtesy call. He watched as the door opened and Duncan stepped out, one hand on the doorframe, the other resting near the buckle of his belt, not touching the weapon but close enough to remind them both it was there. Duncan was a tall man gone soft with years of compromise, his once crisp uniform now faded in places where his conscience had frayed. He adjusted his hat as he approached, but didn't come all the way to the steps, choosing instead to stop a few feet short, like the porch was holy ground, and he wasn't sure he belonged anymore. "Evenin', Marcus," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of something unsaid. Marcus didn't move. "Didn't think we were on speaking terms." Duncan offered a faint nod, more acknowledgement than apology. "Things change." "Not fast enough," Marcus replied, then stepped down off the porch, the boards creaking behind him as he closed the distance. "You here on official business, or you finally decided to tell the truth?" The sheriff looked around as if expecting eyes in the trees, and for the first time Marcus saw something different in his expression. Not arrogance, not defiance, but fear, real fear. The kind that grows when a man realizes the thing he thought he was a part of has outgrown him and might swallow him whole. "I can't protect you anymore," Duncan said, voice hushed. "Not in the way you might think." Marcus folded his arms. "You never did." "That's fair," the sheriff admitted, glancing toward the barn, then the fields, then back to Marcus. "But I didn't know it was this deep. I thought Bragg was just pushing land, not pulling strings out of Baton Rouge, not buying judges, not running a private militia." Marcus said nothing. He just stared, waiting for the part Duncan had come to say but hadn't yet found the courage to voice. "I got family," Duncan continued, voice cracking. "Grandkids. My daughter lives 2 towns over, and they made it clear if I step out of line things might get difficult." "So why are you here?" Marcus asked, not unkindly, but with a sharpness that cut through the excuses like frost through a window pane. The sheriff pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and handed it over. It was a map, hand-drawn, marked with coordinates and dates, locations of planned burns, scheduled accidents, and places where people had disappeared without follow-up or fuss. In the bottom corner was a list of names circled in red, Ethel Freeman's name, near the top Marcus's name beside it. "They're coming again," Duncan said, but not with trucks and scare tactics. "This time they'll make it look like a fire got out of hand, or a gas leak, Something quiet, something fatal. Marcus took the paper, studied it for a moment, then looked the sheriff square in the eye. "Why give this to me?" Duncan's jaw-clenched eyes darting to the horizon like he was trying to outrun his own guilt. "Because I owe your father more than silence. And because you're the only one left who might actually stop them." Marcus nodded once, slowly folding the map and tucking it into his back pocket. He didn't thank him, and Duncan didn't ask for it. Some things are understood in silence better than they ever could be in words. Before leaving, the sheriff turned once more, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Watch the western ridge. That's where they'll come from." With that, he returned to his cruiser, started the engine, and drove away without flashing his lights. Not another word. Not another glance. Marcus stood there for a long while after the sound of tires faded, the cool evening air brushing against his skin like a whisper that couldn't decide whether to comfort or warn. He could feel the shift now, not just in plans or threats, but in the land itself, as if the soil had begun to remember its own history of resistance and blood, and was preparing once again to choose sides. When he finally returned to the porch, Ethel was waiting with 2 glasses of iced tea, and a look that asked more questions than she'd ever speak aloud. He sat beside her, handed over the folded map, and watched as her eyes scanned the page, then narrowed with quiet, knowing fury. "I told you," she said softly, "this ain't just about us." Marcus nodded, took a slow sip of tea, and stared out across the fields, golden now in the last stretch of sunlight, shadows growing longer by the second. "No," he said. "It's about all the people they think won't be missed." They sat in silence, then letting the truth settle between them like dust after a collapse, not disturbed, not rushed, just present. And as the wind picked up and the sky deepened to a darker hue, Marcus felt something shift, not just in the air, but inside him. It wasn't vengeance, and it wasn't fear. It was purpose, quiet, sharp, unshakable, and it was time. The town meeting wasn't planned, not in any official way, not with flyers or bulletins or announcements, but somehow by sunset every wooden bench inside the small Baptist church was filled, every window cracked open to let the warmth out and the tension in. The pews creaked under the weight of bodies and worries alike, and the air was thick with something unspoken, something that had been simmering for years just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. Marcus stood in the back, at first hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room, not for enemies but for courage. Quiet, ordinary courage, hiding in the faces of people who had stayed silent too long. Ethel sat near the front, her cane propped against the side of the bench, a knitted shawl wrapped around her shoulders like armor passed down through generations. To her left was Pastor Jefferson, tall and broad, with a beard gone mostly gray, his hands clasped in front of him as he waited for the murmurs to fade. Beside him, young women with babies, old men in faded overalls, teenagers with nervous eyes, all gathered not because they were certain, but because they were tired of uncertainty. Pastor Jefferson cleared his throat, and the room quieted, not all at once, but gradually like a tide pulling back to reveal what had been buried beneath. "Brothers and sisters," he began, voice deep and steady, "I don't need to tell you what's been going on. You've seen the trucks, you've heard the whispers. And some of you," his eyes moved slowly across the room, landing on a man near the back who looked away, "have already lost land you should have never been pressured to give up." There were no loud responses, no shouts, no clapping. Just silence. Thick, listening silence. Jefferson nodded and continued, "Now I've known Miss Ethel Freeman all my life, and I've known her land even longer. I baptized my daughter in the creek that runs through the southern grove. I helped her husband rebuild that barn after the tornado in '92. And I know this, if someone is bold enough to come after her, they're bold enough to come after us all." A murmur rippled across the room, subtle but growing. Ethel sat still, her chin lifted slightly, but her eyes were damp, not with fear, but with something heavier, recognition. For years she had stood alone, but now in that small room packed with the people she had grown beside buried neighbors, with cooked for prayed, beside something was shifting. Marcus stepped forward, then not as a soldier, not as her son, but as a man who had finally realized that leadership doesn't always come from titles. It comes from knowing when to speak with truth and when to let others carry it forward. "They tried to make us think it was just about money," he said, his voice firm but not raised. "That it was just business. That if we just moved aside, they'd leave us in peace. But it was never just about the land. It's about control. It's about silence. It's about making sure no one around here has enough left to fight with. He looked across the pews and saw faces shift, not into outrage but into resolve. The kind of resolve born not from speeches but from storms survived together, from funerals attended in the rain, from harvests shared in lean years. "They sent men with guns to my mother's farm," Marcus continued. "They came at night. They came to scare us. And they didn't expect us to stand. But we did." A hand went up in the third row. Elijah Brooks, a retired postal worker with 2 bad knees and a heart that hadn't given up yet. "What do you need from us?" Marcus paused, not to think, but to absorb the weight of the question. It wasn't about strategy, it was about willingness. "We need eyes," he said. "We need fences checked. We need to know when unfamiliar cars drive past twice in 1 hour. We need witnesses, cameras, testimonies. And if you've got records, old deeds, letters, sales contracts, you bring them. Because every page we collect is a piece of the story they don't want told." Another voice, this one from the back. Mary Ann from the diner, apron still tied around her waist. "If I bring lunch, y'all better not turn it down." That drew a few smiles, the first cracks in the wall of fear, and then slowly, like someone had given permission, more voices joined in. "I got an old CB radio in my garage, still work. I can patrol the road after my shift. My nephew's studying law. He can help with the records." Ethel said nothing through it all, just sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes shining with something close to disbelief. For years, she had fought to protect what was hers, without asking for help, believing that dignity sometimes required isolation. But in that moment, with voices rising not in protest but in unity, she realized something she hadn't let herself hope for in a long time. She wasn't alone anymore. As the meeting wound down, people began talking amongst themselves, trading numbers, making plans, scribbling notes on the backs of envelopes. Pastor Jefferson stood near the door, shaking hands, offering words of encouragement, not like a politician, but like a man who had carried too many coffins down that aisle and wasn't ready to carry another. Marcus stood near the back again, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. For the first time since he'd come home, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of it all on his own. It had shifted. "Spread out," Taken wrote. And as the last of the light faded through the stained glass windows, casting long colors across the wood-paneled floor, he caught sight of something small but unmistakable, Ethel's cane leaning slightly against the pew as she walked slowly toward the door without it. The room didn't cheer, no one clapped, but in that quiet moment, with the sound of footsteps and low conversation filling the air like music, the community took a shape again. One not defined by fear or force, but by presence. They were there. And they weren't leaving. The attack came just before midnight, quiet at first, so quiet that even the crickets paused, as if they too sensed something unnatural in the air. The moon hung low and full above the Freeman farm, casting long shadows across the field, illuminating the edges of the barn, and the fencing like a stage set for a scene no one wanted to watch unfold. Marcus had been sitting on the porch boots, planted firmly on the plank's rifle within reach, but untouched, his breathing, slow and steady, as his eyes scanned the tree line like a man listening for footsteps in a dream he'd had too many times. Moose was out by the back fence, checking the last of the motion sensors, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight, a slow-moving figure among the rows of corn and darkness. Inside, Ethel slept, though not soundly. Her sleep now came in fragments torn by memory and the distant echoes of a world that refused to let her rest. There had been warnings, of course, more than one car idling too long by the roadside, more than one strange voice on the phone, pretending to be a surveyor or a preacher or a cousin who never existed. But nothing had come for days, and part of Marcus had begun to wonder if the threats had folded under pressure, if the meeting at the church had changed the rhythm of their enemy's confidence. He stood up slowly when he saw the flicker, one light low to the ground, then another, then 3 more scattered along the edge of the pasture, like stars caught in the wrong place. He didn't need to raise the rifle, not yet. He simply reached back, knocked twice against the screen door, an old signal between him and Moose, a rhythm they'd used in places far more dangerous than home. A moment later, a second knock came in return from the dark, and Marcus exhaled once, just enough to let the tension release from his shoulders. "They're here," he muttered. Within seconds, the air shifted. From behind the barn, tires crunched dirt, soft at first, then bold, and voices carried through the field, low, urgent, and mean. They moved like men who believed no one was watching, like men used to being obeyed and never told no. Marcus didn't wait for them to reach the house. He stepped down from the porch rifle slung across his chest, now boots pressing into the gravel with purpose, his breath fogging just slightly in the early chill. The first shot didn't come from him. It cracked sharp and sudden from the south edge, a warning shot into the sky, and the men froze where they stood confused, caught their lights scattering in panicked sweeps. Moose stepped out from behind a row of hay bales, shotgun, raised his voice loud and clear. "You've stepped onto private land. You got 10 seconds to turn around." There was silence, thick and heavy, the kind that wraps itself around people's throats and waits for someone to make the wrong choice. Then, like always, someone did. A figure moved left fast, thinking he could flank. Another raised a flashlight like a weapon. And then it started. Marcus didn't aim to kill. Neither did Moose. The first shot hit a tire, spinning one of the ATVs sideways. The second struck the ground just inches from a man's boot. Screams rang out, not from pain but from fear, and the field lit up with chaos, men running, slipping in mud, ducking behind equipment that wasn't theirs. But Marcus didn't chase. He stayed still, steady, guarding not just a piece of land but the principle beneath it. One of the men, the youngest, tripped over the scarecrow post and fell hard, his flashlight rolling into the weeds. He scrambled, reached for something, and froze as he looked up into the barrel of Moose's gun. "Don't," Moose said flatly, voice like a door slamming shut. The boy raised his hands, breathing fast, eyes wide, the bravado stripped away like bark from a tree in a storm. "I didn't know," he stammered. "They told us nobody'd be here. They said it was just cleanup work." Marcus appeared beside them, calm but burning beneath the surface. "Who's they?" The boy shook his head, too scared to speak, too ashamed to run. Inside the house, Ethel had risen, robe drawn tightly around her, and she stepped out onto the porch with her cane in one hand, the other holding a lantern that glowed amber against the night. "You boys cause all this noise?" she asked, not with malice but with something firmer, something ancestral. The boy looked at her and said nothing. His mouth trembled as he lowered his head. Marcus nodded toward the road. "Let them go," he told Moose, "but take their photos first." And Moose did one by one as the men retreated, some limping, some cursing, all of them quieter than when they had arrived. The pictures would be shared in the morning, names would be matched, and the pattern would continue to unravel thread by thread. As the last truck engine disappeared into the distance, Marcus turned toward the porch where his mother still stood, her face unreadable, her eyes reflecting firelight that hadn't been lit yet. "They'll come again," he said, voice rough with certainty. Ethel didn't blink. "Then we'll still be here." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the cornstalks and lifting the edge of her robe, and for a moment everything stood still. Not with fear, but with resolve. The land beneath their feet, the air between their words, the dark that no longer frightened them, it all settled into place like it had been waiting for this night. Back inside, Moose began cleaning the weapons, methodical, quiet, like someone folding shirts before a trip. Marcus took off his boots, laid them by the door, and sat beside his mother in the living room, where the clock ticked steady, and the windows no longer felt like targets. "You all right?" he asked her. She nodded, slow, her fingers curled around the handle of her cane like it was part of her. "I've been through worse." Marcus smiled faintly. "Not with me standing next to you." Ethel turned toward him, her face softening just enough to show the lines that years of worry had carved. "No," she said, "not with you." And that night, as the fire burned low in the hearth and the wind carried away the last trace of smoke, the house on Freeman land didn't just stand, it endured. Not because it was strong, but because the people inside it had remembered something vital. Some things are worth defending not because they are old, but because they are true. And truth once spoken with courage is almost impossible to silence. The sun was just beginning to rise over the tree line, stretching pale orange fingers across the dewy fields, when Marcus sat down at the old dining table and plugged in the final flash drive. The laptop screen flickered briefly, then settled into focus, revealing a cluster of folders labeled with dates, GPS coordinates, and initials that had once meant nothing, but now, after weeks of watching, fighting, and uncovering, fit together, like bone to joint. The files had come from the phone of one of the intruders they'd chased off the night before, a man too scared to delete his trail, too sure that no one out here had the means or the will to follow it. Marcus didn't speak as the files opened. He scrolled slowly, his eyes scanning every line of text, every file name, every time-stamped video file, with a number code that led to a location he now knew better than the back of his own hand. Beside him, Moose leaned forward, a half-eaten biscuit forgotten in his hand. his brow furrowed with the kind of intensity that came not from curiosity but from recognition. "That one," Moose muttered, tapping the screen gently with a calloused finger. "That's the same tag I saw on the map you got from the sheriff." Marcus clicked it open, and what played on the screen wasn't a document or a satellite image, it was a video. Low-resolution, grainy, but clear enough to see men in uniforms with no insignia walking through the back trail of a different farm, somewhere east of theirs, torching an old barn and dragging something heavy behind them into a truck with government plates. In the background you could hear someone laughing, and then a voice calm practice say, "Get the camera off the faces. Only license plates matter." Moose stood up, ran a hand down his face, and let out a long breath that said more than any curse ever could. Marcus didn't move. His jaw clenched slightly, but his eyes never left the screen. "They weren't just clearing land," he said. "They were documenting it for leverage, for blackmail, or maybe just to prove they could." The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't a rogue operation led by one greedy developer. It was a well-funded, carefully structured network involving contractors, state officials, and a private security firm with deep ties to transportation and energy lobbies. Every parcel of land that had gone quiet had been folded into a shell company within 30 days. Every landowner who resisted had either disappeared from public record or reappeared in hospital intake reports under suspicious circumstances. By noon, the evidence filled 3 hard drives. Marcus labeled each one with thick marker ink: Freeman, primary Freeman, redundant and Freeman, media copy. Moose packed them in separate padded cases, one destined for the local news station, another for a trusted friend in the Attorney General's office, and the third to be hand-delivered to a journalist Marcus knew from his military days, someone who owed him a favor and, more importantly, knew how to protect sources. "You ready to send this out?" Moose asked, zipping the final case shut. Marcus nodded. More than ready. They didn't speak much as they loaded the truck. The mood wasn't celebratory, it was steady, focused, like the final stage of a mission that had taken too long and cost too much. When Ethel stepped outside, she didn't ask what they were doing. She just looked at the boxes, then at her son, and gave a nod that said she understood. "They gonna fight back," she said quietly. "You know that." Marcus turned toward her, the late afternoon light warming the lines in his face. "Let them." He paused for a second, then added, "We're not just defending anymore, Mama. Now we're holding them accountable." That night, as they sent the files out, one upload to the journalist's secure server, one drive handed off at the edge of town under cover of night, and one mailed in a battered envelope with no return address, the air around the Freeman property felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but cleaner somehow, as if truth had begun clearing space for something new to grow. Inside the house, Marcus sat down with Ethel and Moose over a quiet dinner of cornbread and black-eyed peas. The news hadn't broken yet. The world outside was still turning unaware of what had just been set in motion. But the 3 of them knew. They ate in silence for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be explained anymore. Ethel broke the quiet first. "When your father started pushing back on Bragg's father," she said, her voice steady, "they told him he was wasting his time, that nobody would listen, that justice wasn't meant for folks like us." Marcus looked up. "Did he believe them?" She smiled faintly. "Not for a second. He just knew it might take more time than he had." The clock in the kitchen ticked softly as they sat there, the weight of generations folding gently into the quiet. Outside, crickets had begun their nightly song again, no longer interrupted by headlights or threats. The land exhaled, if only for a moment. And when Marcus finally stood stretching his back and walking to the window to gaze out over the fields, he didn't see battle lines anymore. He saw evidence. He saw testimony. He saw the shape of justice beginning to form, not in a courtroom yet, but in the hearts of every person who would read the stories, see the footage, hear the names, and remember what had been done. The fight had changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about truth. And truth, once let loose, didn't need permission to move. It only needed direction. And now it had that. The courthouse was packed, but the silence was so deep you could hear the faint echo of a shoe scuff, the floor. Rows of wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of townsfolk, reporters, law clerks, and unfamiliar men in dark suits, whose eyes rarely blinked and whose expressions gave away nothing but control. Outside, a protest had gathered along the sidewalk, small but firm, holding cardboard signs painted in thick black strokes that read things like "We see you, Bragg," and "This land remembers." Inside, the air felt thick, not just from humidity, but from anticipation, the kind that makes your hands sweat even when you're sitting perfectly still. Marcus stood by the tall courtroom windows, his arms folded, suit clean but simple, not expensive, just dignified. He'd shaved that morning for the first time in weeks, and his face still bore the faint imprint of the razor along his jaw, a reminder of the discipline he'd learned in uniform, and the ritual he returned to when preparing for war. Because that's what this was. Not a trial in the traditional sense. Not just paperwork and cross-examinations. This was the confrontation of decades, the culmination of whispered corruption, buried threats, and bloodless violence done under the shield of bureaucracy. Ethel sat in the front row, her cane resting across her lap. A dark blue dress carefully ironed her silver hair, pulled back into a soft bun. She didn't fidget, she didn't blink, she just stared straight ahead, waiting. Her presence was a statement all by itself, living proof of endurance, resistance, and the generational pain that had been ignored by every man who had ever sat behind that judge's bench, pretending not to see. The judge arrived without ceremony, a tall black woman in her 60s, with a voice like polished steel and eyes that had seen more than she ever said. Her robe brushed the floor as she entered, and the gavel struck once sharp final. "Court is in session," she said. "Let the record show we are hearing opening arguments in the case of the state versus Russell Bragg." At the defense table, Bragg looked smaller than he had on television. His tailored suit couldn't hide the slump of his shoulders or the paleness of his skin. He didn't glance toward the gallery. He didn't meet Marcus's gaze. He stared forward like a man trying to hold on to a world that was already slipping through his fingers. The prosecution rose first, a young woman named Darlene Hunt, whose words were quiet but relentless. She didn't speak with theatrical flair. She didn't raise her voice or pound the table. She let the evidence speak: deeds, videos, names, maps, recorded phone calls that outlined a web of collusion so vast it made even the courtroom feel too small to hold it all. And every time a new name was read aloud, an assessor, a banker, a code inspector, there were audible shifts in the gallery. People recognizing people. People remembering promises. When she played the footage, drone shots of burned farmland bodycam clips from private security units operating on unauthorized property, and the now famous clip of the young man who'd cried out, they said nobody would be home, there was no sound in the courtroom, no gasps, just a long, excruciating quiet that hung like fog, heavy and true. Then it was Marcus's turn. He took the stand slowly, the wooden chair creaking beneath him, and when he raised his right hand to take the oath, he held it steady. No tremble, no hesitation. His voice was calm, as he answered the questions, each one delivered with surgical precision by the prosecutor. "Tell us what you saw the night of the 17th of October. 3 vehicles, 2 ATVs and a flatbed. No license plates, no badges. They came in quiet. They came to burn. And did you confront them?" "I did." "Were you armed?" "I was. I had every legal right to be." The prosecutor nodded and stepped back. "And what did you find the next morning?" Marcus looked across the courtroom, not at Bragg, not at the jury, but at Ethel. He spoke without bitterness, without flourish. "I found a surveillance drone lodged in a pecan tree, still recording. I found a set of boot prints leading from the barn to the fence line, and a lighter engraved with the name of a subcontractor on Bragg's payroll. And I found my mother sitting on the porch holding that lighter in one hand and her Bible in the other." A murmur moved through the gallery, soft but undeniable. The judge called for order and Marcus stepped down. As he walked back to his seat, he caught a glimpse of Bragg shifting in his chair, rubbing his temples with his thumb and forefinger, like a man who'd just remembered something too late to change it. Later, when the defense had finished its bland rebuttals and the judge called for recess, people gathered outside the courtroom in small, buzzing clusters. Some whispered, some wept. Others just stood in the hallway, leaning against the walls like survivors waiting for the wind to shift. Marcus joined Ethel on a bench near the back entrance, away from the crowd. She didn't speak for a long time, just looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Finally, she said, "Your father would have been proud of you today." Marcus looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. "He'd have told me I talk too slow." Ethel laughed, soft, brittle, but real. That too. They sat there in quiet reflection, as the courthouse emptied the echoes of footsteps bouncing off marble floors and stained glass windows. And when Marcus finally rose to leave, he paused by the courtroom door and looked back one more time. Bragg was still inside, sitting at the defense table, head in his hands, his lawyer whispering something urgent beside him. And Marcus understood in that moment that victory doesn't always come with cheers or flags. Sometimes it comes with stillness. Sometimes it comes with the sight of a man who once thought himself untouchable, sitting in the same room as the people he tried to erase, knowing now he would never be unseen again. The days that followed the courthouse hearing passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar, like the land itself was trying to relearn how to breathe after holding tension for too long. The Freeman farm no longer felt like a battlefield. There were no patrols, no lights creeping through the trees, no tire marks in the soil that didn't belong. Instead, there were children playing near the creek again, elders walking slowly along the fence line just to feel the sun on their faces, and the occasional visitor from town stopping by with a pie or a story, or simply to sit in silence with Ethel because now they could. Marcus spent those days mostly outside, tending to things that had waited too long for attention. Loose shingles on the shed, broken hinges on the south gate, the tire swing that had hung crooked for years. His hands moved with the steady grace of someone trying to rebuild more than just what had been damaged, and his thoughts drifted not to what had already happened, but to what it meant that it had finally stopped. Not ended, just paused. Like the earth was giving them space for the first time in a long time to remember who they were before all the fighting. One morning, just after the dew had burned off and the light took on that golden softness reserved for late spring, Ethel stood by the garden beds staring out across the field where wildflowers had begun blooming along the edge of the fence. Her cane was propped against a post, forgotten for the moment, and her hands rested on her hips the way they had when Marcus was a boy, and she'd catch him sneaking biscuits before supper. He approached without speaking, just walked up beside her, and looked out at the same stretch of land she was watching. "Looks different," she said, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "Not better, not worse, just not the same." Marcus nodded. Maybe that's what peace feels like when it first arrives, quiet, unfamiliar, a little out of place. Ethel chuckled a dry, amused sound. "Well, I'll give it time. Everything feels strange after a storm." They stood there together for a long while, watching a pair of crows chase a hawk across the distant sky, their wings flashing dark against the blue. Neither of them spoke about the trial, the evidence, the way Bragg's name had been wiped from company signs almost overnight. They didn't need to. The truth had landed where it needed to land, and the rest would take care of itself. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived hand-delivered by a woman from the state wearing a smart gray suit and a badge clipped to her lapel. She introduced herself politely, shook Ethel's hand with sincerity, and explained that the farm had been added to the historic land registry under an emergency designation. That meant no future development, no seizures, no claims by private firms or state contractors. It meant protection, recognition, permanence. Marcus read the letter twice, standing under the shade of the front porch, his thumb brushing over the embossed seal near the bottom. He looked over at Ethel, who was sitting quietly in her rocker, eyes closed, listening to the sound of the wind sliding through the leaves. "You hear that?" she asked without opening her eyes. Marcus smiled. "Yeah. I think the land just exhaled. For the first time in months, there was nothing to prepare for. No patrols to organize, no statements to write. No files to back up and ship off under cover of night. Just the day, the sky, and the feeling that something fragile had finally been held together long enough to matter. That evening they held a small gathering, a handful of neighbors, church members, the young journalist who had first broken the story. They didn't call it a celebration. Nobody brought balloons or speeches. Just food, folding chairs, and music played from an old speaker resting on a windowsill. Children danced barefoot in the grass, and old men sipped sweet tea while telling lies about fish they never caught. There was laughter, not loud, not forced, just easy, like it had been waiting for permission to return. At some point, as the sky shifted into shades of lavender and dusk began folding over the ridge, Marcus found himself walking out past the barn, drawn by the stillness that had once signaled danger, but now felt like an old friend. He walked the edge of the property, slowly, boots kicking up soft dust, hand brushing against the tall grass like he was making sure it was real. And when he reached the southern post, the one where the scarecrow had once stood burned and broken, he saw that someone had built a new one. Same denim shirt, same straw-stuffed limbs, but now with a wide-brimmed hat and a small wooden sign nailed to its chest that read simply, "We're still here." He stood there for a long moment, just watching it sway slightly in the breeze like it was nodding in time with his thoughts. Then he turned and walked back toward the porch, toward the warm lights and the smell of cornbread and the hum of voices that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Ethel was waiting when he returned, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes soft with something that looked a lot like peace. "You see it?" she asked. "I did," Marcus said. "It's standing tall." She nodded, then leaned back and closed her eyes again. "Good. Let it remind them. Let it remind us." And with that, the night settled in, not heavy like before, not edged with threat, but full grounded alive. The fight was over. And what remained was home. In life there are moments when we feel too small to stand up against injustice, too alone to protect what's right. But this story reminds us that strength doesn't come from youth or power, it comes from perseverance, integrity, and the spirit of community. A 93-year-old mother stood her ground under pressure, and her son came home not just to defend land, but to protect a lifetime of memories and values. Then neighbors, friends, even those who had once stayed silent stood up too, not with weapons, but with truth, with compassion, and with unity. The lesson is clear: even if you've retired, even if you think your time has passed, your presence, your voice, and your experience can still change an entire community. Never underestimate the power of truth, and never believe it's too late to do what's right. Because sometimes it's those who've lived the longest who hold justice up the strongest. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that truth, justice, and humanity still matter in today's world, please support us by liking this video, subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next story, and sharing this message so more people remember it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Thank you for listening.